Joy in learning, folks. Hi, I wanted to go over some carving techniques today. So I'm going to show you some example, and then I will go into more detail. This is a jar that I made in a workshop, and it has the freehand carving, and then it's filled in with underglaze. First the black is put on and then wiped off, and then this green underglaze was painted on. The reason to use underglaze here rather than glaze after it's bisqued is that the glaze could run down, whereas underglaze stays put. So we could make this as one of our projects if you're interested. Has a lid and an inside rim, which is a little bit tricky, but not too bad. So that's incised carving. Here's another example that has not been fired yet. It's still greenware. I took a stamp, an elephant stamp I have, and pressed it into leather hard clay so that I could make an impression. So in this was not freehand, but the stamp made the impression. But then I put on black glaze, wiped it off, just like the other process, wiping off as much or as little as you want. The second technique here on this plate, though, is to take the stamp and just put underglaze on it and then place it on the top of the leather hard clay. So this is not down into the surface, it's just underglaze on top. So that's two different techniques of getting the underglaze look on the plate. Another recent example, the leaves on this example are the same as on the jar. It was cut out with a pencil. I just used a pencil to draw in those leaves, then put on black underglaze and wiped it off to get the outline of the leaves. Then I used a tool like this to carve in some detail of what I hoped would look like lavender. And I used underglaze, hopefully, to give me more of a watercolor look. So I put on blobs of diluted underglaze to look like watercolor. And then in the particular holes, I put more underglaze that was not diluted. So in the same piece, it gives you two different depths of the underglaze, which hopefully will give the piece a little depth when it's fired. This example, which has been fired, is not a line carved into the clay, but a shape carved into the clay. So I drew it on with pencil, and then behind his wing, behind his head, carved away the clay so that the owl and his branch would actually stand up above the surface. So when you run your finger over this, you feel the difference in the depth of the clay. For example, that leaf might be 1/8 of an inch higher than the surface behind it. This was, I used a Zentangle look to put the rest of the texture in his face. So I'm going to go over a little bit more of how to do this carving where you're actually carving the clay away. I have 4 bowls that I've decided to use that technique on. So the first step is basically decide what you want for your decoration. And believe it or not, I used this as my inspiration. However, it did not turn out anything like that, which is very usual. So the first step is to put on basically what you think you're going to carve with pencil. So on this example, I've just put on with pencil and not tried very hard not to get a line. I just want a guide for myself. So that's first step. The second step, and this is all when it's leather hard now, is to start taking away clay from around that line. So for example, here, make sure you can see this. I have taken clay away from the bottom of the line and the top of the line. If I turn it around a little bit, I have not taken the clay away here from the top of the line. So I'm going to use the corner of this tool to dig into the leather hard clay, and I'm going to hold it on the inside to provide support. And this clay is a little bit stiff. I've been putting it under plastic and water, spray it with water, put it under plastic to try and get it a little bit more damp. But basically, I'm still able to take a Sharpie tool, sharpened corner tool, and run it along where I've put my line with my pencil. And then I can either use the flat part of this. You just have to find out what tool is going to work best. I could use a round tool to scrape away that clay behind the image. So it's kind of like watercolor in the sense of you're leaving the clay to make a statement. You're taking away the background. So what the viewer is going to be seeing is the clay that's left on top. Okay, so now I've gone around that. I go fairly slowly. Sometimes I use that right into almost a line, but other times you can try and take away more at a time by positioning your tool like this, putting it at an angle. And now I've not only got a line here, but I've got more clay taken away. So the interesting thing here is by having your finger behind where you're carving, you can feel how thick or thin the clay is. Obviously, you don't want to go through the surface. That would basically ruin the piece. So you want to make sure that you're just, so what I do is basically, you can see it's not very smooth yet, but I might go over it. That's better, smoother. In my next example, I've gone all the way across the bottom and top of where I want my design, and it's pretty rough. Right here, it's rough. So in this step, I'm going to just try and smooth out that clay. And I'm not using water. I'm just using a tool flat against the clay to try and make it smooth so that you don't see the lines where the clay has been taken away. You just see what remains. And this background is smooth. So that's this step, as I'm just trying to get this gradation so that it's not noticeable. So I'm probably using a pretty flat tool and flat on the surface. So just a little bit less pressure as you go out away from the carved area. So I'm using more pressure in here and less pressure as I go out here where where I want to blend it into the piece of the clay that's not having any carving on it. So I would go around both top and bottom and try and get this smoothed out. Okay, you can tell this bottom here is more smooth than the top. once, so on this next piece, I had already done that. And what I want to do now is make it just as smooth as possible. So this is the first time I am going to use some water on it. Okay. And I've smoothed it already from here to here. Here I haven't smoothed it, so I waited to be able to show you. The way that I've smoothed it is put a little bit of water on the top and the bottom of the clay. That is not going to be taken away. If you use very much water here, you are going to make your pattern that's cut out less defined. You're going to smooth the edges. So I'm trying just to smooth the clay that's outside of the edges. So now you might be able to see that this is smoother than down here. So if I turn it around, again, I've got my fingers on the inside providing support and being able to feel it. I might use a tool like this, where I can just barely scrape the surface, but I'm leaving a line with the point of that tool against the carved out area. So I am sharpening actually the side of this zigzag that goes around the bowl. So this is now pretty smoothed out, and I would be willing to now go ahead and bisque fire this. So typically you use a transparent glaze on something like this because you want to be able to see those lines, and rather than a heavy glaze which would cover them up. Lots of times, and Antoinette Badenhurst does this kind of carving. She'll put a pastel glaze inside and a white glaze outside. But I'm going to keep mine probably just clear. So that's how you can tell that pretty much all of the pencil lines are gone at this point. And what you see is what it's going to look like after it's bisqued. So it's a slow process, but it's enjoyable. And, you know, I like sitting on my porch and doing it. So thank you, and we'll go over questions.